So I'm here to talk through on this video with you about dyslexia in your classroom, and we're going to have a real look at practical strategies to support students. Um, Airy-fairy and kind of all theoretical is not very helpful when you've got a class full of students, lots of children who have different needs, and you need to know what to do to help them to be their best selves and to keep your workload reasonable, manageable, and just to make your job an enjoyable job. So my name is Dr Helen Ross. I am dyslexic and I've been teaching for a long time, and I'm going to share a little bit of my insight with you today. So just to give you a brief overview about what we'll talk through on this video, I'm going to do an introduction and give you a little bit of background on me so that you know who I am and kind of what cred I have, as it were, to talk to you about dyslexia. I will talk about what dyslexia is. I'll map it onto the British Dyslexia Association definition, which is grounded in the Rose Report, which came out in 2009. There's been a little bit of tweaking subsequently. There are new discussions happening with the professional bodies around dyslexia at present, with January 2023 at the moment, and there are discussions happening and kind of a lot of work going on to explore whether a modified, updated version of the definitions can be agreed on. So watch this space, but for now the definition I tend to use when I work is the BDA one, because it's very well operationalised, thanks to Mr. Jim Rose from 2009. We will look at what it looks like in the classroom. I will link directly to the definition. We will then look at things you can do, because that's what we're here. We teach. I'm not in the classroom anymore, but I still work with students, and we want to know what we can do to help our children. There are also some websites at the end with further reading that you can have a look at, and hopefully there'll be things that are useful for you moving on. So a little bit about me. I am a dyslexia SPLD, so specific learning difficulties. If you see SPLD written like that in special needs things, it tends to mean specific learning difficulties. So I'm an assessor and I'm a teacher, and I love it. I'm very lucky that I get to do it. I have been a Senko in a private school and in a mainstream little primary school near where I live in Trowbridge. I'm a charity trustee of a couple of charities. One's American not-for-profit, that is called the National Coalition of Independent Scholars, and that's about promoting research excellence, because one of the hats that I wear is research, and I'm lucky that I get to do that. And I'm co-vice chair of the British Dyslexia Association, and I am chair of the Wiltshire Dyslexia Association. I'm a researcher and a consultant. I'm a doctor. It's a sociology doctor, not a medical doctor, and I use it all the time for my work. I'm very lucky that I get to do that. And I'm dyslexic. I hate reading. It's just not my thing. I do it, but I'm not very good at it. But I do the best I can, and it's important. So I'm not saying don't read, but I struggle. I struggle. So that's my background. Hopefully that kind of contextualizes what I'm saying to you while I'm talking today. So here, what is dyslexia? I'm not going to read it out. You can pause this video. You can have a look at the links below. I will make sure that they're accessible. But the things I've highlighted, and I've highlighted them in separate colours to make it clear, hopefully, to you that they are different things. Phonological awareness, verbal memory, and verbal processing speed are kind of the key markers for dyslexia, as opposed to other specific learning difficulties. Implicated in specific learning difficulties in general are often motor skills, working memory, concentration, and sort of things that make learning tricky, but that I say, so if you've got dyscalculia, DCD, or dyspraxia, so DCD is developmental coordination disorder, there are commonalities which might be motor skills, the kind of these little bullet points at the bottom. But the key thing that makes dyslexia what it is basically it's like dealing with sound and spoken information and linking sounds to words. But I will go through bit by bit and link each of these highlighted sections to what dyslexia looks like. So firstly, we will start in order they were written. Phonological awareness. I was doing some research for something else, and I found this really cool definition. Like, it's such a simple, really well explained like explanation of phonological awareness. It's the ability to analyse the sound structure of oral language, processing sound, playing with it, making sense of it. And it's so well written by Krajewski and Schneider. again, it comes from the same time as the Rose Report, but it's well written, it makes sense. So phonological awareness, that's the kind of, it's like playing with sounds. So when children in Key Stage 1 are learning to read, they're doing blending, segmenting, quite a lot of work happens with non-words because they can't rely on their knowledge of language. So it's looking really at kind of manipulating it. You know, you might get children to do rhymes. My little boy's 3.5 and I spend a lot of time looking at rhyme with him, and he started really playing with sound. It's looking at words in sentences, sentence structure, as well as phonological awareness. Onset and rhyme is how words start and how they continue. And then sort of in addition to phonological awareness, you're processing sounds, you're looking at phonemes, which are little sounds, and syllables. And one of the really important things, it sounds like it should be a basic skill, but clapping syllables, some children really find that very difficult. So all of these things build up into kind of your ability as phonological awareness, your ability to engage with sound, process it, make sense of it, mess with it, change it, switch it up. If that's wobbly, then the other skills around reading and spelling are likely to be quite wobbly. So when somebody's got wobbles with phonological awareness and it shows in their reading, I mean, reading can be hard for a myriad of reasons, but if it's linked to phonological awareness, it might look slightly different. Quite a lot of this is around hesitation and kind of starting to read something and then restarting. When I assess children and their phonological awareness is quite wobbly, there's no automaticity, so kind of this reading isn't necessarily fluent. They have to go letter by letter, sound by sound, which means they hesitate because they're working incredibly hard to decode at word and letter level, which means that it just can get very, very demanding for them. And because they're working so hard to focus on letter by letter decoding, they quite often, and I have this, you kind of don't know the key points of what the text is on about, so you end up having to read things lots of times to pick up what's actually happening. And it's really tiring. I speak from experience and I speak from looking at kids while they're trying to do this. It's really hard. They might often lose their place because they're working hard at word and letter level and they just can't take information in. And proofreading is really hard because you read what you think you wrote, not what you actually wrote. I absolutely speak from experience here. So many things are involved in reading fluently, reading effectively, and it's a really, really demanding process that if one of those kind of elements is wobbly, then everything falls apart potentially. So where reading is tricky, there are lots of things you can do that actually don't cost a lot, that are fairly time efficient, that are fairly labour unintensive and can make a child's life a lot easier and subsequently make your life as a teacher easier because the child is finding ways around things to get themselves that bit more independent. So reading rulers, fingers, ruler guides. I use my finger to read. Why on earth not? I've got a finger. I might as well use it. It helps me. Or I use a pen. Let kids do it. What do they lose? Well, if they don't do it, they lose their place and then things are really hard. So if they need to use their finger, why not? I do, I'm 41 years old and it makes my life a whole lot easier. Where kids really struggle with blending and segmenting words, it can be really helpful to give them access to keywords and spellings before they need to use them in class. So kind of teach them pre-teaching and post-teaching so they've got time to get involved and make sense of them properly before having to engage with them in class. It just that bit of familiarity and then reinforcement afterwards. Structured comprehension questions, so not saying what does this text mean, but chunking things down bit by bit. And do they need to write stuff or can they just say stuff? And this idea of reading aloud, let them volunteer if they're comfortable rather than going around the class and telling them it's their time and their turn to talk. And assistive tech, my computer reads everything to me. It makes my life so much easier. There are lots and lots of brilliant gadgets, lots of kind of pocket-sized pieces of tech that kids can use that also are exam sound, so JCQ has approved them. Worth a look, and it can save money in terms of TA person power as well. And time. The recurring theme through this presentation is time is your friend. Time, wriggle room and as low stakes as possible, because it just gives kids that bit of wriggle room. It is so important. Phonological awareness wallops spelling quite hard as well. It hits it hard. It's really tricky. If you can't link sounds to letters and letter groups, or if you can't hold on to sounds, manipulate them, spelling things can be really, really difficult. So here, and if motor skills are implicated as well in dyslexia, here is where it can be incredibly depressing, and actually where red pen happens all over work, it's very difficult. I remember getting scribbles on my books, and again, I've got a PhD, so I'm clearly clever, but my writing is awful, my spelling is awful. Dyslexia was very difficult for me. I see it with my kids that I assess, I see it with kids I've worked with over the years. If we can take the burden of physical writing off kids while they're getting to grips with spelling, it can be brilliant. Fridge magnets, they're brilliant. Or like, there are little wooden letters, hands-on letters. There are two things going on there. They don't have to write, but also they then can feel the letters, so it becomes a multi-sensory experience. And it can make things a lot easier. And if it's on a fridge magnet at home, they're walking past it every day, so they're seeing it, they can play with the words, they can write silly words on the fridge. It's just quite nice. We've got them in our house. It's good fun. Dyslexia friendly dictionaries, they are accessible as things actually sound, rather than because of the sort of complexity of the English sound system, rather than how they're written. So they can be really, really helpful for children. When you're marking work, the kind of red or whatever colour you use, the teacher pen effect can be edifying, or it can be soul destroying. So if students really struggle, focus on one pattern, get them solid on one pattern of mistakes and spelling errors, so that we're building them up, and so that they gain confidence, and then kind of move along bit by bit, so that students are built up. We're about edifying children, we're not about making them feel small. At sound and sort of syllable level, colour and highlighting things can be really helpful. So if you're working with a group of children in a small group, do the clapping on the table, brush things on the table, highlight things, different colours. If you've got the chalk pens and tables and you're allowed to, and if they're cleanable, maybe write with chalk pens on the table, but only if the table's actually clean, because if they don't, it's a bit tricky. But it's this multi-sensory thing, and again, time is your friend with these things. It's just so important. Now, memory difficulties are it's quite a nebulous thing. Working memory within sort of certainly the English education system, but generally in the kind of Anglophone Western Hemisphere, working memory is implicated in a lot of things. There seems to be a huge amount of pressure for children to do everything mentally, quickly, straight off the bat, without writing things down, and it kind of makes me a little bit sad, because if working memory isn't a measure of how clever you are, it just means you can hold things in your head and manipulate them or not. It means you can hold lists in your mind or not, or it's very difficult. So it's a really, it can be very, very upsetting and really compromise children's and learners' self-confidence. And in writing, it really shows up in kind of organisation skills, or where its organisation is quite wobbly, because you're trying to hold on to ideas in your mind whilst concurrently focusing on spelling, the mechanics of writing, and it just, something often gives. And so when it's a memory problem, the structure might be sort of quite wobbly, or not fully coherent, might not make sense. Or if what's written does make sense, the students have had to write very slowly to make up for the fact that their memory is very wobbly, which can make it hard. And quite often the kind of classic thing is that written output, your written stuff is not as strong as your verbal stuff, because you can explain yourself. Students are very articulate, they can tell you a proper yarn and make things really brilliant creative ideas verbally, but then if they try and write it down, it's so wobbly. Messy writing and wobbly spelling, these things, again, spelling, you're holding sounds, letters, processes, words in your working memory and trying to write them down. It's just a very demanding process. There are ways around it though. So where a student has a wobbly memory, keywords, have some classrooms that can be quite busy, so it's important to have in mind for it not to be too busy on the walls, but keywords on the walls, keywords on the board, keywords for students who struggle with copying, have them next to them on a printed sheet. I'm looking at my desk because I'm doing this, pointing. Writing frames and sentence starters, it jogs your memory. It gets students thinking, and I find these helpful. And again, I've said it, I'm 41 years old. It just helps. Sometimes alternative recording methods, so using pictures, using storyboards, a little video explaining things. Not everything always has to be written down. For some students, a scribe can be helpful. And kind of scribes and assistive technology, you know, typing and speech to text, they can be so emancipatory. I would say scribes helpful, but actually assistive tech, it emancipates kids, it sets them free, and they're not reliant on a grown-up. They can just get on with things by themselves. So I'm a big fan of tech. Obviously resourcing is a different but very linked question. And if it's about making notes, gap filler exercises and copies of notes, you know, copying from the board is dead time, because kids are working so hard to actually writing, to get the information down. They're not focusing on what it actually says. So let's make their lives easier and just plonk them a printout on their desk. And support with proofreading. Windows or Apple or Google, they've all got things that read stuff aloud. Just makes life easier. Now the other implications of memory difficulties, kids might zone out because they are working so hard to keep focused that they're tired, and sometimes they just for a moment drift off, and that can mean then that they've missed something, and then kind of re-engaging can be very difficult. They're not being lazy. If somebody struggles with their memory, they are working 10 to the dozen. They are working hard. It is hard. So they're not, you know, they might look like they're being lazy, but they're not. Something that's actually, and this is linked to verbal processing as well as memory, finding words. So you're trying to, it always happens at the dinner table at our house, where you're trying to find, like, I need the salt or something, and I'm trying to ask Mr. Dr. Ross to pass me the salt, and I'm like, pass me the, and I can't find the word. In my house, it doesn't matter. If you're in the classroom and you can't find the word in front of your classmates, the social implications of that are strong. The net effect of that, it's quite upsetting, it's frustrating, and it's really, really hard because people don't necessarily understand the student, which means they disengage. So just have heed of that. And sometimes it linked to the zoning out or difficulties finding words. Students might not remember instructions, so it might look like they've not listened or they haven't bothered, but they just can't remember because things go in and out because their working memory or their short-term memory is wobbly. And this actually has some quite substantial effects in things like maths and sciences, where processes are really, really important. And there are things we can do. There are lots of things we can do. We can use things like multisensory resources, so colour, images, different inputs, anecdotes, things like mnemonics as well. Can be really helpful to just jog those bits of memories. I don't get on with it because my memory is such that I can't remember stories to help link ideas, but for some people it sets things on fire. It's brilliant. And concise instructions, don't reel off a list of like a recipe for students to do. Give them little chunks of information, 3 things at a time. Written prompt, just so they've got something to refer to, whether it's written or pictures, something helpful, and be focused and succinct. Ask kids to summarise information, don't you keep talking. And it also then breaks up lessons, makes things easier to follow, because it's an exchange, it's a dialogue rather than teacher talking all the time. Verbal processing is all about fetching things out the back of your head and bringing them forward. And I think I remember at some point looking at a kind of map of the brain, and I think it is pulling things from the back of your head to the front to be able to articulate it. And where verbal processing is wobbly, it always makes me think about trying to find a good pair of shoes in your wardrobe. You know, you've got one of your shoes, this really cool pair of shoes, and I like shoes, so it's, for me, as an analogy, you have this shoe, you know you've got 2 of them because most people, that's how it is. You've got one, it's there, it's ready, waiting to be put on. You've got to find the other one, and you know it's at the back of your wardrobe, but good Lord, you can't find it, and you're looking everywhere and you're working hard, and eventually you find it, or you might not, and you might have to change your tack. That's what verbal processing feels like, or wobbly verbal processing is like. It's hard. You are working 10 to the dozen to get ideas, to find things, and because it takes time, by the time you've got got the information you want, the moment might have passed. And then students in the classroom, goodness, it's soul destroying. It can be so upsetting to just not be able to find the word, the concept, the idea that you're trying to use in that moment. And when we assess for verbal processing difficulties, we look at skills like rapid naming. So it's that process of kind of reeling off a list of things. So it might be, you know, colours of a rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Some students might really need to think hard about what those are, and they're like, red, I can see it, I can't think what the word is, and they just might not find the word orange. They know it, they just can't find it. And so it's that process. And this has a really strong effect in reading as well, because when you're dealing with sight words, so sight words are words that, you know, English is a bit silly with spelling, so it's things like the, that, you, to common words that don't necessarily follow common regular spelling rules. And English is just bonkers for spelling. There are so many different ways to make the same sound, so many letters have so many different sounds. So this sight word information is very, very strongly implicated in reading. If you can't pull things out of the back of your mind quickly, it affects your automaticity and your fluency, which then affects, can you decode things, can you make sense of things? You're working 10 to the dozen really, really hard at word level, maybe at sentence level, that again, you lose that sense of what's happening and what the gist of a passage of text, or you can't find the detail in something. And and that's across the board curriculum wise. It affects every subject in equal icky measure, because it's really hard, and it can make children feel very small. So give kids time, you know, where possible with this one. It's about time. And for socially, again, for children socially, if they're with their friendship group and things move quickly. Kids, we all talk quickly, we all speak at a rate of knots. If children are in a group and kind of finding words, following the conversation is tricky, socially it's going to be a little bit difficult for them. So dyslexia in this sort of element really does have sort of wide-ranging effects. And socially, you know, there's a reason that people with specific learning difficulties and dyslexia struggle with their mental health, because it's hard work and it can be really upsetting. So this is a really important thing to focus on for me, certainly. I think it's really substantially important. There are things we can do though. Verbal processing, minimise copying from the board. Again, because kids are trying to make sense of the writing, they're trying to make sense of what the sentence says, and then copy it, get it all down, make sense of it, get it all in their book or on their paper. Instead, time. Give them handouts. Let them take a photo, depending on school policies, depending on device access. And here, give kids verbal prompts, check in with them, talk to them briefly, subtly. We don't want to make them stand out, we don't want to make children feel small, but check in with them during sessions, make sure they're happy, make sure they're confident with what they're doing, and talk slowly, you know, slowly, succinctly, not in huge great swathes of text, and check in with students, you know, stop. Like, it's not dissimilar to with memory wobbles. There's so many of these things, these strategies are helpful for all students, but pause, give time for kind of digestion of ideas and instructions, and get kids to talk to each other, get kids to check back with you, what are we doing, why are we doing it, what's the topic we're looking at. And again, step-by-step instructions, so that children, young people, don't have to remember everything, they don't have to process everything at once, keep it all in their head, they don't have to make sense of it all. There are things to refer back to, and again, it's this idea of repetition, but gently. Flowcharts actually can be a really, really helpful way to get students remembering stuff, because there's minimal text, but there's images that show the direction of movement in whatever work they're doing. It shows a kind of sequence, and if it's one of those things like in maths where there's sort of potentially different directions that the task can go, a flowchart's actually a very, very clever thing. And I seem to remember from back at university, they did engineering, they're used in sort of logic and electronic engineering. I may also be completely wrong because it's 20 years since I did engineering, but flowcharts are really helpful, or can be really helpful depending on your students. Now, one of the things that as Senkos, as class teachers as well, just as people working in education, one of the things we need to have in mind is this concept of additional, above and beyond strategies. Now, SEN lists, learning support lists, whatever your school calls the grouping together of students who find learning difficult, and how they categorise it, because there are so many different interpretations of the SEND Code of Practice, the 2015 one. So many different interpretations, but I think the general consensus is at least students who have above and beyond strategies, so kind of stuff that's more than just in the classroom, they will be on a school SEND register. Now again, kind of where schools draw that line will depend on the school. It's like reasonable adjustments, differs across the board school-wise. But things like online literacy programs, there are lots and lots of different online literacy programs. I'm not going to go into what's good, what's not so good, because different settings, different kids, different personalities, different things that are tricky. There are ways to do it. There's something that may qualify in your setting as, you may count it as above and beyond, you may count it as just kind of run-of-the-mill support for children, but I think they can be really helpful. And if it's online, kids can, if they have resources at home, they can do it at home, which means they're practicing little and often, and it's independent. And I link that to precision teaching. Precision teaching can be it can be phenomenal, but it can be quite labour intensive for a classroom teacher, and monitoring it can be a little bit tricky when you've got 30 other children, lots of different things going on in a busy classroom, and teachers are human, and we must keep this in mind. Teachers are human who sometimes need to be able to make things sustainable. So an online literacy programme for me can sort of behave a bit like precision teaching, in that you can set kids off at the beginning of the week or on a day ending in Y, and then for the next few sessions they can crack on with things by themselves. The nice thing about an online programme is you can log into the kind of back office element of that and monitor how your children are doing. You can look at what they're doing and how they're doing it, which is really, really important. And whether these things then, you can sort of then do that in one-to-one or in a small group session, but their online work or their independent work is them and their work. And if you've got a back office in whatever form where you can monitor their progress, ultimately that's what you need to be able to do. ICT as an above and beyond strategy. Now, I have my thoughts about tech. I'm a big fan of tech. I live in the world. Tech is expensive. Schools are not flush with cash, so quite often laptops, tablet PCs, electronic readers, they are an above and beyond measure, because they have to be, at the moment, schools can't necessarily spend X £100, X £1,000 on each student to get them a piece of tech, so they tend to be very targeted and are subsequently something above and beyond, because schools, for it's not casting blame at all, they just can't buy them for everybody. We're subject to the systems we're in at the moment. Again, IEPs and pupil passports, these are sort of personalised documents that different schools call them different things, lots and lots of ways of having them addressed, but they're really powerful things. Help monitoring progress. They can sort of help teachers know what to do, and also they can incorporate student voice. So a lot of IEPs and passports profiles that I see have an element where kids and students say what they want, what helps them, what doesn't help them. They're really, they can be so powerful when they're used carefully. Again, for this talk, it's not about telling you what I think must be done, because I have no definite opinion. It sort of links to access arrangements and normal ways of working. This concept of reasonable, what's reasonable, feasible, possible in your setting, it looks different. And so all of the above bullet points kind of come under reasonable access arrangements, because there is no one answer. There's the answer in your setting. I would say the thought process, the questions you need to ask yourselves is fairly uniform. You know, what have we got? What are our kids' needs? How can we deploy things? And what do we want to achieve for our children? How are we going to do it? Those sort of questions, you know, if you're a leader in a school, if you're a Senko, you ask yourselves those all the time. The questions are uniform, fairly standard. The responses, however many schools there are in the UK, is how many answers there are. And actually, I think it's really important that schools have freedom to answer and respond to questions, needs as their cohorts of students, because they change, as they need it. To dictate from above would be wholly unhelpful. Now, the next slide I've included here, this is from a review I did around supporting students with specific learning difficulties. I'm not going to talk through everything about it, but it's sort of quite helpful to understand what's high impact and low cost, because let's face it, again, schools haven't got loads and loads of resources. Little things like, and it's not for dyslexia and visual discomfort or visual stress are not the same thing, but coloured overlays can transform a world. If students find words wobble, find it tricky, and a coloured overlay helps them, they cost a couple of quid off Amazon or from, you know, whichever your local purchasing school supplies organisation is. They're brilliant. They can be brilliant. It is not a substitute for a dyslexia assessment. It's not for dyslexia, it's for visual discomfort. Different thing, often coincident, but not always together. And one of the things that I found when I did this research, software interventions, so this idea where students have like a phonics program, but it's online, monitored by a teacher or a teaching assistant in the background. These are the things that don't cost the earth, but if used well, if monitored well, they can be life-changing for students. The report is available online. I'll make sure that the link is visible, but if not, just Google Helen Ross support systems for individuals with SPLT, and it was a Council for Science and Technology report, so it is publicly accessible, and it's got a lot more detail, but the diagram is quite a nice summary of the report I did. But I think really the key point with this is time is your student's friend. Schools have to make reasonable adjustments. Any setting by law within the Equality Act has to make reasonable adjustments, and dyslexia is explicitly mentioned in guidelines around this, so it matters. But reasonable adjustments are not the same in each setting. But time, that's a reasonable adjustment. Don't put kids on the spot. Give them wriggle room around answering questions. Make their lives easier. But ultimately, we all want our kids to do well, and so why would we not give them a bit more wriggle room if we can do? This is me finishing up here talking, and hopefully this has been useful. If you have any questions, do feel free, pop me in Google Helen Ross dyslexia, and I'll be able to answer questions as best I can. But yeah, I really wish you well, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I really hope it's been useful. Have a lovely day. Take care.